We all know that patience is a virtue, but sometimes we need the courage to be impatient. Hi, I'm Father Kevin Zubel. I'm a Redemptorist missionary stationed in Baton Rouge. Of all the things that I hear in the confessional, if there's one thing that comes up over and over and over again, it's patience or impatience. People are impatient with their spouses, they're impatient with their kids, they're impatient with coworkers, or if you're like me, you're very impatient on the road. Sometimes the most difficult thing about life is that we have to share the world with other people. So often I hear people come into the confessional and say, Father, I wish I were more patient. I wish I listened better. I wish I didn't lose my temper so easily. I think a lot of us have that prayer, but as a priest much wiser than me once said, be careful when you pray for patience, because God will happily answer. We may not be ready for the response. And so what is it that we're really praying for when we're praying for patience? What is at the root of our inability to really embrace the virtue of patience? Well, I think a lot of it is that patience requires a tremendous amount of energy. It requires a tremendous amount of attention to others. And sometimes after a long day, sometimes when we're stressed out by the things around us or things going on, we just don't have the energy to be patient. We come home and we're at the end of our rope and the smallest thing sets us off. Well, I think it helps to understand what is patience to begin with. Well, it's interesting. We have the word patient to describe someone or describe us when we're trying to be calm and attentive and not overreact, but it's also the same word we use for somebody in the hospital. So how did that happen? Well, the word patient comes from Latin and it literally means to suffer. And the word patient means one who suffers or one who bears suffering. And I think that makes sense to a lot of us in the hospital, but I think it also makes sense just in the patience of everyday life. A lot of it is bearing with things that make us suffer, or bearing with things, even the smallest little things that make life a bit of a burden. But the problem with this word, with patience, is it's something passive. It sort of positions us as someone just having to grin and bear it. But I think as Christians, when we're called to the virtue of patience, we're called to something else. We're not just called to just suffer in silence, to just grin and bear it. But we're also not called to erupt and to explode at every turn. So what is it that we Christians are looking for when we ask God for patience? Well, we have many examples in scriptures, and I think the most beautiful, or one of the most beautiful that we encounter, is in Paul's letter to the Colossians. And this comes from chapter 3, verse 12 and following. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. When we as Christians talk about patience, we talk about it as one tool in the toolbox that we have in building these relationships of love with one another. And so I think where we sometimes miss the mark when we try to ask for patience or be more patient people is we go back to the idea of patience as something passive. That's something that we suffer on our own in silence. But the reality is, as Christians, we're called to accompany one another. Patience for Christians means that what we're trying to do is we're trying to be attentive to the needs of others. We're trying to let others help us when we're feeling at the end of our rope. And so I would suggest that rather than patience, because I think as Americans we often think of things very individually, that we look for a word that better defines how we bind ourselves to one another. And I think we get it here. One of the things Paul talks about is compassion. Now, the word compassion is similar to the word patient. The word passion speaks to suffering, and compassion literally means to suffer with. And so rather than patience being something that we suffer on our own, compassion helps us to understand that we're called to walk with one another, to suffer with one another. And so perhaps when a spouse has done something or said something, or our children aren't behaving as we'd like them to, if we take a breath, we try to think about what are they going through? What are we going through as a family? What are we going through at work? What are we going through as a community? What are we suffering with together? And how can Christ bind us in that bond of love so that we don't suffer in silence, we don't just grin and bear it, but we suffer with? And this brings me to the point that sometimes we're called not to be patient. There's times when we need the courage to be impatient, to be anxious to move, to act, to not be willing to just sit and bear things anymore. As Christians, we're called to a life of justice. Christ has called us to serve one another, to look to our neighbor, and to proclaim liberty to captives, to help the burdened, to help those who are vulnerable and marginalized. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was responding to a lot of the people who were helping him in the movement, who were supporting him in the movement, but were telling him, "You're moving too fast. You're pushing people too hard." And so he wrote this beautiful letter from Birmingham jail, this powerful treatise to explain to people why we can't wait. He said, "We've been waiting 300 years. How much longer are we supposed to wait to act?" And so sometimes, especially when we think of civil rights, or when we have to stand up for the unborn or other people who are victims of offenses against dignity of human life, sometimes we need to be impatient. Sometimes we need to do what the late John Lewis would say, to make good trouble, to speak up, to speak out, and to act with urgency. So perhaps the next time you feel at the end of your rope, don't pray for patience, pray for compassion, and be ready to join Christ in this great mission of bringing to life his kingdom in the world.